Hey guys, welcome to another CG Cookie live stream. I'm here with the famous Jonathan Williamson, right there.
How we doing, everyone?
It's been a while since he's been on a live stream, so it's a treat to have him. And
I'm not
he's
sure I
gonna
remember how to do this, actually.
be, yeah, we're gonna be looking at some artwork, and there's a community contest in the works, and so this is one of the checkpoints on the way through. Some people submitted their artwork, and so we're going to be taking a look at it and just seeing how it goes, how it could be improved before you guys submit the final one. It's super cool to see all of you here in the chat already. Tons of people, regulars, some first-time people as well. So it'll be a good time.
Active.
Yeah, super active. I feel like we just keep getting more and
first
more.
checked in, we're like, oh, there's already 6 pages of chat, and we haven't even looked at it yet.
Yeah, I couldn't even catch up all the way. But I think that is a good problem to have.
I would say so.
Exactly. So we're going to try to do this in an hour, so let's just dive right in. The first one that we're going to look at is the Flintstones car by Jere. And I want to give you a little bit of a snapshot or a little backstory on each of these, what the author wrote as they submitted, just so that we get some context on what's going into this work and kind of where they're at and what they think about it as well. So the first idea was to get as close to realism as possible. After blocking out the shapes and the first few times spent on the project, I realized that is not going to be the case with my current sculpting skills and the deadline. So it started to lean towards stylized, at least that's how I see it, and that's when I just stopped worrying and tried to enjoy myself. It would be nice to hear some notes about the overall design and the details of the sticks, wood, and rock. Does the model read well? Would it be better to try to make it more realistic, or maybe go overboard with the stylizing? Are the materials recognized as rock and wood? That's most of the things that are on top of my mind at the moment. And as always, if there are anything that catches your eye, I would be more than happy to hear any critique you're willing to give. Thanks. And yeah, the fabric, leather roof, and back window are under construction. Basically, all they are for now is tweaked planes with cloth sim and a wrinkle normal map. And then, in addition to that, they said that's all they have for the critique request. The rest is just what they wrote about the process. But I wanted to include that as well because I think that it's really interesting. Kind of speaks to the creative process. So, sculpted, retopologized, and normals baked. Next is some more learning in Substance Painter that I finally started to figure out a few weeks ago. And this is the part that I think is really cool. He said, I'm not a big fan of cars, motorcycles, airplanes, trains, or other vehicles, though I like traveling and enjoy driving motorcycles, but never have been interested in such things. Seeing the given topic gave me somewhat of a cold sweat, but of course I had to give it a go because these are challenges after all. It's funny to think that even if I'm not a fan of vehicles and sculpting is never my first chosen approach, I still ended up with a subject that includes sculpting and, of course, is a vehicle. It's been a delightful process so far, and I remember enjoying the vehicle sculpting part of Kent's vehicle class from last year. It must have been the spark that helped me when picking the project. So I think that's super cool that you pick something that you might not have initially have thought you would even be interested in at all, but by the process of doing it, you've had a lot of fun, and I think that that's super awesome. Jay, can you think of any times that that's happened to you?
It's been a while, but I mean, a lot of times I would find, I would start a project, and whether this was, whether I was modeling or even something completely unrelated to CG, it could be working on a web development feature, it could be programming a Python script, whatever it may be, where you start out dreading the project, and then kind of by reframing the entire idea of the project and how you approach it, suddenly you find yourself really enjoying it. And one of the things that first sprang to mind with this one that I really liked is, number one, sculpting vehicles is hard.
Yeah, it is.
I think when a lot of people, and I know I was guilty of this, you hear, hey, we're going to model vehicles. And, so often in CG that goes to, hey, we're going to make sports cars. We're going to make something that's flashy. And the moment you try and start sculpting something like that, that's all made of clean, crisp lines, it's really hard. And so for Jere to flip that around and say, well, let's instead make something that's super rustic, that embraces sculpting. And in this case, the Flintstones car, what a perfect choice. It's awesome.
Yeah, it's so fun that you can't help but enjoy it.
Yeah, not to mention the result is really nice.
Yeah, turned out super well. So on to some suggestions. So for anybody who hasn't seen the Flintstones, this is an example of the Flintstones car itself. Jay, did you watch the Flintstones?
A little bit. I didn't grow up with TV, but so like anytime that I'd go over to my grandparents' house or something like that, invariably the Flintstones would be on and we'd see them. So like I loved them growing up. I just didn't watch them a whole lot.
Nice. I mean, I know it was on when I was a kid, and I just never ended up watching it. So I felt
Yeah.
kind of out of the loop, and frankly, I had to Google a little bit to figure out like, oh, this is it.
Nice. No, for me it was very very nostalgic, and that was something that, particularly like if you're going to choose something that is well recognized by people, it can be hard because if you don't do a good enough job at it, people don't recognize it, and you've missed the point. Like in the case of Fred Flintstone's car, like to me, it was instantly recognizable. The moment I saw, it, like I knew immediately what it was, even without seeing the reference. Like, so he managed to capture that really well.
Yeah, and it's so iconic that like even not having watched the Flintstones, I still realized that it was like at least based on that, even if it wasn't like exactly. And then I looked it up and it's like, oh, this
Sure.
is like
This is
exactly
it.
that. Like it's just photocopied in a way.
Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so super good representation for sure. And I had some notes on here, but also keep in mind that like there's definitely a tension between something that's like a faithful representation and something that is you take some artistic liberty with it. You think about movies that they right now there's a huge trend of taking animated movies and making them live action, and a lot of that stuff just doesn't quite translate, and so there has to be some sort of, I don't know, artistic liberty or tweaking things to make it work in both ways. So I do have some notes here on like the structure of things, and they're just suggestions because again, it deviates away from the original design of the cartoon, so it might make it less nostalgic or like less recognizable, but it also makes it work a little bit better in this more realistic style that you've chosen. So take it or leave it either way. They're just things that might help in general. So first, things are looking like they're just going to fall apart immediately, and that's probably part of what's funny or entertaining about the original car. So again, take it or leave it, but if you tie things together or just like bolt the seats in a little bit with like wooden pegs or something, put like ropes or lash down the wheels themselves, that might help it look like it'll be staying together a little bit longer and won't just fall apart immediately. But I don't know, is that
like
part of the
using
fun of it?
Well, I think there is. The if you go back and watch the original comic, one of the things that was always funny, like you always felt like his car was always on the verge of just falling apart.
Okay.
So, but that being said, Jere already has the lashing in some parts of this. So, for example, like the back seat, how it's then attached to the ceiling awning and things like that. Like he's already using the lashings there, and so basically just taking that same concept and applying it to tying down to the main structure, tying the axles into the frame. So I don't think that would actually, I don't think it would detract from it at all. But it does add a more tangible aspect to it. I mean, at the end of the day, it doesn't need to be too crazy because it is a car that is powered by feet that is a rolling boulder.
Yeah.
He's already got superhuman strength to it. So, but I think it would just help kind of bring the whole thing together, just like you said.
Cool. Yeah, because I wasn't sure about that. And what I also love about this is just the more I look at it, the more absurd it is, which is just so fun. Like the steering wheel.
Yeah, it's awesome.
Like there's a steering wheel that obviously like it's not going to do anything. Not just because it's not
It's a steering
connected,
wheel, but,
but also because there's no way to turn. Like you only have one wheel.
It's like your toddler's steering wheel on a grocery cart. And, it's there for entertainment purposes only.
Exactly. So that's awesome. And maybe if you wanted to like bring it, like add a little bit of your own style to it, you could just find more of those like absurd things, like review mirrors that don't have mirrors or something, that are just like leaves. I don't know.
Like a slab, just like a slab of slate, and I think that those kinds of things would be really fun. One thing that I would totally love to see is to see this fully textured. Like I know there's a lot of details here, and I don't know if Jura was intending strictly for modeling feedback or anything, but this is definitely one of those models that like it's just begging to have a nice hand painted texture on it. That would be awesome.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that was.
Well, and
Go ahead.
And even like with the with the wheels of sorts, to see the shading differences from where it's worn down from rolling to then the sides of it that are nice and untouched. There's a lot of nuance that you could work into the design just through texturing in this.
I think so. I think that would be a huge bump. One of the other notes I had just on artistic style is like really carving out that wood a little bit more in the wood on the side with sculpting, but also texture painting would have a huge effect on this. And if you want an example of that, our axe texturing exercise has kind of similar style. The wood will be slightly different.
It and the new treasure chest course.
Oh, absolutely. That's
also all hand painted texture, and it's all hand painted texture in wood. That would work very, very well for the same type of thing.
Yeah, that's great. So yeah, check out that treasure chest course, and it uses 2.8 as well, so it'll be up to speed. And I think that'll make a huge difference because like that's a good way to like tie the slightly more realistic but also quite stylized things together.
Yeah, definitely.
Yeah. Any other notes on this one?
No, I think that pretty much. I think you hit it. Should we move on to the next?
Cool. Let's do it. Number 2, Tybol Karadek has a luxury hover car. And he said, after some hesitation, I decided to go to a realistic luxury hover car. I did the biggest mistake of all and didn't use enough reference image for starting. Well, none to be fair. And that resulted in a lot of trouble for size and proportions of basically everything. The other problem is that having started maybe even by directly copying an actual luxury car would have helped me increase the level of detail on the front of the car, which is pretty bland in the end. Another issue is the detail level. I did aeration grids with way too small details that can't be seen in the final render. It's still a work in progress and needs some extra modeling, namely the door interior and polishing the global interior. I'm not very happy with it, but I'm still proud that my first project after following the first part of the hard surface modeling tutorial went out pretty decent. I would have never been able to get even close to that a few weeks ago. As for the scene, I went for a simple car reveal showroom. So first of all, just based on your notes, this is already a really cool result for being a beginner to this and not having really made these kind of cars before. This is really impressive. Like, cars are very, very difficult.
They're incredibly difficult.
Yeah, I mean, Jay's modeled more cars than I have, for sure. But yeah, they're very challenging.
Yeah. Well, and one of the things I think is so challenging with cars that, kind of gets taken for granted, particularly when you start designing your own original cars, which is something that I've never really done, and I would not even want to try because I don't think it would come out nearly as well. All the car modeling I did was always from real world references of trying to recreate an exact car. And one of the things that you start to notice that like the more cars you model, the more that you look at them, you realize like there is so much design, particularly when we're talking, like sports cars and muscle cars and, higher end cars, which definitely I think you're shooting for in this design is that it's kind of intended to be, a luxury convertible hover car, maybe in the, line of like a Porsche or something like that. And when you start looking at those designs, you realize there is so much nuance in every component of those cars. There's a reason that they spend, I'm sure months and months and years on them because every little detail adds up. But even with that said, I think you've overall done a really excellent job on this because one of the things that's really challenging with cars too is everything is so smooth and sharp, and so any little deviation in your surface fidelity just becomes abundantly clear when you have this super glossy finish, and you have that. You've got a super glossy car paint here that all of the white highlights just come through immediately, and there's a couple of blemishes here and there that we can see, particularly in the highlights. Like right above the front left wheel, you can see a little bit of an area. And I think you've got your paint over actually, since you have the screen control.
Let's look at that. First, we have just a couple extra renders, with close-ups and stuff, and then the final shot that I wanted to include. This wasn't what was submitted, but it was in the work in progress thread, like after that, and it had some like smoke on the bottom and glowy parts. And I thought that was really cool. And then I have a little paint over as well.
Yeah, so like you can start to see these little areas where Lampel's put down, fix the topology here. Those little tiny deviations where you see like a slight squiggle of sorts in the highlight. That's a surface issue. And fixing little things like that can actually go a long ways towards making sure that the surface itself doesn't take you out of the experience, because so much of a car like this, particularly when you have a black car paint, it's all about those smooth flowing highlights, and then suddenly you get a little jag and it disrupts that. But I think overall, you've done a really nice job. Definitely, we've got a couple of comments here like that the background is super bright, which definitely, like, I can understand why you did it. Having the white background works well to show, the Vega, the future of cars now, and for the reflections in the car. But I think it also has a problem that it creates too much contrast, and so you're taking all of the focal point actually away from the car. In that when I look at the whole render as a whole, the first thing my eye gravitates to is Vega, not the car, and the car is secondary, because you've got so much negative space there that's so bright, the contrast. So I think actually moving this over and actually basically maintaining these black curtains and having the car really stand on its own, and using, to keep the white reflections, you can basically do like a studio effect where you've got the studio lights coming down from the top, where they're completely invisible to the camera, but because of the reflections, they'll come through really nicely. And since you've got these nice gradient curves along the sides of the car already, along the tops of the wheel well, those reflections are still going to show up nice and sharp if you get your angle right. But the car will suddenly pop a lot more by not having the bright white background. Alternatively, you could make the whole background white and basically treat it as if it was a white studio, and then the car will really pop because everything is white.
Ooh, that too. I didn't think about that.
Yeah. Then you had a couple of comments here, Lampel, if you want to take over.
Yeah,
just a few things and gradients and.
Yeah, I added a little bit of just like soft gradient across the car, because one thing that I noticed is that it's very, very flat in a lot of these areas. Because it's so glossy, the lights don't really spread throughout. It does a little bit kind of on the floor with the reflections, but because it looks like it's only using one glossy node and it's just extremely reflective. So like this color of black over here on like the right is the same as over here on the left, and there's no real like differentiation between those two areas other than some of those like really sharp highlights. So by going over it and just adding a little bit of gradient between these different surfaces, then you can better tell the shape of the car. And the way that you do this in 3D is by adding maybe another glossy node and then mixing that in, but with just much more roughness. And so you're kind of layering the different materials on top of each other. One of them is quite a bit more diffused, then you have one on top of it that's very glossy. You could probably do multiple layers if you want, but I think that gives you a better car paint effect, as well as helps you show like the shape of the car. What do you think about like materials wise here?
Yeah, I mean, I think one thing that would help a lot, because you see the gradient in a couple of places, but I agree having more there would help a lot. But another way that you could do it is using like paint flecks. A lot of car paint shaders will basically have like some fleck layers where, in the real world, it's basically like flecks of paint, and I know they used to be, I don't know what they are now, but where you see that depth of the paint color, and from different angles you're going to get a little bit more blue, a little bit more black, and it helps to, not only does it give you that little bit of car paint sparkle that a lot of times, particularly in older cars we see it a lot, and newer cars it tends to be a little bit more of a very, very subtle thing, but what it also helps is to get more of that variability in the car, in the actual shader itself, because depending on how your light source is hitting, you may get almost like a blue glow within the black paint, where
Ooh.
more of the flecks are reflecting light, and so it just gives you more depth to your shader. And if you look at actually, I think, doesn't Kent have he's got a lesson in the Shader Forge course on creating car paint.
Yeah, I believe so.
And that can be really helpful. Just getting the depth of the layers, like how Lampel mentioned, of using multiple glossy shaders, using adding in some noise in there. That can just that depth of the shader does a lot to give you some variability within the the surface itself. And the other thing that's really nice about that, beyond just potentially looking really good, having a nice highlights and things like that, is it helps bring out the details in some areas. Where right now, one of the things that I think starts to happen a little bit with your car, particularly if you're on a dimmer display or like if you're looking on your phone outside, everything's not nearly as bright, is it all starts to kind of blend together because frankly it's too dark. And it's not that it's too dark in the paint choice. There's lots of black cars on the market that still pop really well under the sun. It's that there's not enough depth to the paint shader itself.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And then the only other two like smaller things that I had, one were the few areas of fixing the topology that helps the highlights go smoother. We talked about that already. Adding a few more of these like little glowy bits around the car just to tie in with the wheels so that it doesn't look so disconnected, I guess. So you could try to find some ways to like sneak those in. Not too obvious, but just a few. And then I thinned up the like windshield. It seemed like an odd shape. I don't know. That's maybe preference. I know, Jay, you have some notes on like proportions and just design wise.
Yeah, I mean
things.
the thing that stuck out to me with the windshield is that you have this really smooth flowing curvy car and then a very flat top windshield, and the flat top just it feels out of place. And I don't want to get off into car design or anything like, because I don't want to make it sound like, oh, I'm a car design expert. I don't know anything about car design. I just look at them a lot. But the thing that I notice is particularly the sharp corner and then the very flat top just to me seems counteractive to the rest of the really smooth curvy design of the car.
Yeah, that makes sense. Totally. I see that.
And then actually one last comment on the lights that you mentioned is, given that all of the lights, the car is clearly on in the case that it's hovering. We've got these glowing lights around the hover wheels, around the hood, around the mirrors, things like that. One thing that might tie it all together is just turn the headlights on.
Yeah, good point. That makes sense. And then, yeah, I also just shifted the future of cars now sentence over to the left because it was like jutting up right against the car. That's a fairly small and easy change. Yeah, any last notes on this guy?
Nope, I'm good.
Cool. Yeah, really good work though. I mean, cars are really difficult, so
Really
two thumbs up already. All right, next from Cash, we got Future Rescue Helicopter. And basically, the idea is to show a futuristic rescue helicopter landing on some godforsaken place near some tents. What I'm aiming for is believability, realism, sure, but more that when you see, you go, oh yeah, I can buy that. I have the scene built in Unreal Engine 4, so I can change things quite drastically even. Also, this is lacking rigging, so all the things are still stuck in their default places. So this is cool, especially that it's like rendered real time in a game engine. Makes it pretty cool. So I think that's just like added props for like making it low poly but still look really cool.
I think I would have really, this is a complete side tangent, but I think I would have really enjoyed using the modern engines today when I was first starting in CG, because I hated rendering, but like ultimately what I wanted to do was like to create these scenes and vehicles and such that were interactive, and now you can do that.
Totally, and it does. I think it takes a little bit of extra work as well to like optimize for that. So props to you for going like the extra mile and making sure that it does actually work in a game engine, because you don't get quite as much like detail, or like you don't have the polygons to spend that you normally might have in some of these other higher detail renders. So it's extra tricky.
And we did we just got a new copy of that render in chat. You just put in a link to it.
Oh, cool. Okay, I will link to that as well. But while I'm looking at that, do you want to talk about your notes first?
Yeah, let me make sure I got the right view up. There we go. So I just had a couple of comments in general. Number one, like I like the vehicle design. It's fun. The main area of comments that I have is actually the integration of the vehicle in the environment. And since this is in Unreal, take everything with a grain of salt, because frankly I'm not as familiar with Unreal. Like I know that these things are possible. I just have no idea how to actually do them. But the first thing is that I think your camera angle is wrong for what you're trying to achieve. You mentioned that you're trying to showcase this vehicle landing in a godforsaken place, And because you've got an upward camera angle, honestly, like the impression I get is actually that it's taking off. And so simply moving your camera to point more down to show, basically help create the story that, hey, this vehicle is coming in to land, showing where it's landing, or even just, directing your camera in the direction that the vehicle is going, I think would help a lot. The other thing, if you can work through, oops, I just skipped the wrong one. Adding a bit more depth of field to it would help a lot, to bring the focus to the vehicle, depending on what you want to showcase. If you're trying to illustrate that, these are perhaps a fleet of vehicles coming in to land in this area and the environment is more important, then this may not apply. But if your focus is the vehicle, then having a tighter depth of focus such that the environment's a little more out of focus would help a bit. Same thing, and this may apply a little bit to your rigging comment, but right now the propellers either have too much motion blur or appear to be non-existent. And so it's hard to tell that they're actually there, which doesn't help with the sense of movement. It almost feels like it's floating in place because you can't really get a sense that it's coming down to land. And so even doing a little bit of work with, I'm not actually sure how you would do this on Unreal. I know you can, but basically doing some air distortion to show the heat rising off the propellers or the blur of the propellers themselves would help. And then maybe, the other main thing would just be some color variation in the vehicle. Right now, everything is very clearly, it's just like a single coat of red within some wear and tear around the corners, which looks good. But something you might consider is how does the shading and the texturing of the vehicles imply the story. So you mentioned before that it's landing in a godforsaken place. Well, to me, that implies that this is probably the vehicle's probably been through a lot. It's probably everything's messy. There's not a lot of cleaning and maintenance available. So chances are it's going to be a lot dirtier, a lot more worn out. And so even just adding some basically wear and tear to the surface of the vehicle, I think would help, again, communicate that story a lot more. Lampel?
Yeah, absolutely. And here's the updated render. I'll throw it up here as well. I don't know if I can make that any bigger, but oh, here we go. Yeah, so this is also it's a really cool angle. I would say the exact same thing. Oh, you do have some dust coming off under the wings, which is super cool.
Oh, yeah.
The propellers.
Nice.
And it does still look like it's landing rather than taking off because of that camera angle, but that's not necessarily a bad thing. It's just, if that's what you're going for, then you could change it. But since the top definitely has, or it seems to have the most detail, then it makes sense to kind of show the top, and you can have it just taking off. That's totally fine. But yeah, a few other notes as well on top of what Jay said. I have the example of the kind of gyrocopter. I don't know exactly what we called it, but
Yep.
Jonathan Williamson modeled this quite a while ago, actually.
It's an old model.
Yeah, it was very old, and then I went through and
It looks
updated
so much
it a
better
little bit.
now than whenever I made it, though.
It's the same model. I just made
Textures
it
do
game ready,
wonders.
and yeah, a couple textures do. Well, I guess that also speaks to exactly what we're trying to say, is that texturing this with more than one color and then some bolts and stuff does quite a bit, because most of this is just one single color, but there's just a slightly darker variation of that color, which is used to make some patterns, put in some stamps, and there's areas of very, very fine, small detail of different labels or warning signs, don't step here, things like that, and then also very large patterns just going over entire panels in areas of total empty space kind of. And I think the mixture of all those things together definitely helps, whereas in the model that you have everything as sort of the same, every area has the same amount of detail, which makes it look very uniform throughout the entire thing. So if you have some areas where you have really, really small panels, and then areas with very large panels, some areas might have lots of small stickers or decals, and then areas that are completely blank. I think mixing those up and kind of focusing those sharper details on the areas where you want more focus to be at or like around the edges of things, I think would help quite a bit. Obviously, this is by no means a perfect example, but it's like going towards that direction of like more variation, while still kind of keeping like one single color.
And yeah, that having that variation of both like detail density and color density can make a huge difference in just the composition of a model.
Absolutely,
because it adds contrast to it. It adds interest, even if I mean, sometimes it can be as simple as adding stripes to the wings that all it does is break up the visual monotony and suddenly makes it far more interesting. Even if the change, just as you've got here in your paint over, that those little tiny changes make a big difference to the interest level of the vehicle.
Yeah, I think so. And in the paint over, I just made some colors like slightly darker and less saturated, just as like a quick, easy thing. But if this is like a search and rescue helicopter, now that I think about it, white would probably be a good like secondary color to kind of like highlight things, because red and white's kind of like the medical kind of color.
Yeah.
And I think that would make a lot of sense. But beyond that, the only other note is like take the black areas and make them not quite so black. They're like totally black. If you make them just like a darker gray, I think that would like fit the model better overall. And yeah, I think that's it. Oh, also, yeah, there's a few bent panels that kind of like warp over the shape, and that's technically possible, but with the design that you already have, it makes sense to like break up those areas into kind of like sharp angles rather than kind of like warping them around the shape. Any other notes on the helicopter?
No, I think you got it.
Cool. Next up is Insect Flyer by Spiky. Still a work in progress. The legs need to be rigged so that I can pose them. The wings need to be more rounded to better fit with the rest of the design. What I mostly, but not only, would like to know is if the composition is okay. I know there are still a lot of modeling problems, but I wouldn't be able to fix everything, so I'd like it if you could tell me what you think that needs to be changed, because I've been looking at it too long, so I can't really judge what is most important. Very relatable, by the way.
Oh yes, very relatable.
Yeah. The overall design can't be changed anymore, but feel free to comment on that as well. Small changes might still be possible. I was thinking of the Moth shuttle from the late 90s sci-fi series Lex. Couldn't find any halfway decent pictures of it to show here, though. But then a bee, and not organic but mechanical. Cool. This is also like just another one that I looked at it and thought like, oh, this is fun. Like, this is a fun design.
This is a really cool design. Go ahead if you want to start.
Oh, okay. Well, your notes are first.
Sure.
Jump in.
Okay, so I had just a couple of comments, particularly as they relate to composition. I think the composition is mostly fine. I think what's missing here is depth. And some of the depth could be simply a matter of adjusting the focus on your camera, adjusting the depth of field. So like if you look at the far off, I'd call it more of a wasp. If you look at the wasp flyer far off in the distance, it's still pretty sharp and in focus. And yet if you look at your background, everything is out of focus at the top of the hill, which appears to be about the same distance as the other flyer. So just doing a little bit more to try and match the camera in Blender to the real world camera that would have been used would help a lot. Right now, part of the problem is that like it feels very much like a CG scene set on a real world background, but that they're not integrated. It doesn't feel cohesive, and a large part of that is simply the depth and the actual lighting itself. And this kind of applies here too, where on the main flyer we have these really sharp shadows, even though it's sitting on a fairly rough ground with lots of little tufts of plants, and it becomes pretty obvious pretty quickly that it's actually sitting on just a flat textured plane. And so even going in and doing like, actually this can be really simple, like areas on the textured plane here where you've got tufts of grass, if you just put in like a small protrusion, just sculpt it up a little bit such that in the actual textured plane it has height, even though there's no actual detail. All it does is it changes the disturbance of the shadow on the ground such that it looks like it's actually casting shadows on the plants and rocks and things like that. So little details like that, you could even probably take your ground plane, desaturate it, increase the contrast a little bit, and use that as a displacement map would probably be more than sufficient just to get that little extra bit of tangent character, or not characters wrong. That tangibility to make it actually feel like it's sitting on a real world plane. Um,
That's a
and
great
then,
idea.
that's the main thing, the depth of field. The other thing I didn't notice this as much before is I would love to see almost like a little swap in the detail where like if you look at a wasp or most insect wings, you notice that the wings are incredibly intricate and detailed, and you've got a lot of that detail in the leg model in the previous render. Lampel, if you want to maybe bounce back to that for a second.
Oh, sure.
So like if you look at the legs here, there's an incredible amount of detail in them, but unfortunately, I think you've done a little bit of a disservice because from the composition that you have, all of that detail is lost. And so it kind of starts to feel like the legs got all the attention, and then the rest of the body was a little bit of an afterthought in terms of the detail, just because of the way that it's balanced. Now, that's not to say that the body needs a lot more detail, but I think particularly things like the wings, how the wings connect to the body. Obviously, like if this is a mechanical vehicle, and in order to have that, kind of like articulating wing, you're going to need a pretty sophisticated joint in there, much including a lot of the same types of detail that you've worked into the legs. So I'd love to see that same attention to detail applied to something like the wings, particularly since, both in the main shot and the secondary flyer, and then even the one off in the distance, the wings are kind of the focal point. And I don't know if that's intentional or not. I would kind of assume that wow, I'm blanking on the word for the capsule the pilot sits in. Cockpit, there we go.
Yeah.
I would kind of assume that the cockpit entrance would maybe be the focal point, but to me, the thing that I'm constantly drawn to is the wings, and specifically, it's the contrast between the wing in the back, which is really bright and getting a lot of the light, and then the wing in the front, which is mostly in shadow, and you've got this really nice angular contrast. Plus with the sky in the background as opposed to the dirt, like that's where my eye is drawn. That's the focal point to me. If that's intentional, I don't know. And then lastly, the other thing is, I feel like the body and the abdomen itself they're a little too square. Like it looks a little bit like you basically took a cube, subdivided it, and then squared off all the corners, which is totally fine. But if you start to look at a wasp, you notice they're much more much curvier than that. And I think that this sharp line that you see in the shading, if that's intentional, maybe embrace it a little further and give that line a reason to exist. Whereas right now it just feels a little too square, and we'd love to see it rounded off to create a more organic shape to it. And then I don't know if this is a scale issue, but I do feel the wings are a little small. Beyond that, I've never seen the original movie, but I love the concept. I really do. Like, the thought of putting the cockpit in the head of the wasp, and then the very organic but mechanical feel is really cool.
Yeah, I like it a lot. And yeah. I mean, you covered most of the things that I was going to mention. A couple of things I'd want to highlight that you already said was definitely the detail and the connection point between the wings and the body. I feel like it's probably the most important, as well as the very like boxy feel of it overall, especially in the back. And even if you don't change the model, or like you don't have time to before the final render, you could still change the lighting to make it feel less boxy, where you don't have this like harsh line kind of coming over the back here. If you kind of smoothed that out, or put a light kind of in the corner here, so that it hits the top and the side equally, it'll make it kind of feel less like that. But beyond that, one note on the ground is that this shadow is going to be pretty tricky to put on top of the grass, because you already have some light coming from the sky that it's shadowing the grass, and you can kind of see the shadows underneath that. But then you're putting a shadow on top of that, and so it makes everything else darker. So you're like layering the shadows. But really what would happen is it would just cut off all light, and so the shadow would be one color. They don't really add together.
Point.
What's that?
Good point.
Yeah, I don't know how to like describe it with words as much. But if you take this and instead of just like multiplying it, if you use a function like darker color or darker. I don't know what else would do that, but I think that might help a little bit. Also, just
I'm not good enough with color math to answer that.
Yeah. I'd have to play around with it a little bit, but they shouldn't like overlap on top of each other. And they could probably use to be like a little bit softer as well. It's very, very, very harsh. Beyond that, yeah, any last notes on the Wasp bot? It's well done. I mean, again, it's very tricky.
I'd love to see it textured. You know, one thing that, of course, is, you know, it's fine because of where the model's at, but one thing that definitely breaks the composition is that you've got this real world textured environment, and then a mostly untextured Wasp that's mostly just, you know, like smooth aluminum basically, and that's fine, but like that until it's fully textured or you've got a deeper integration within the scene, there's always going to be that disconnect between the environment and the vehicle.
Totally.
Which is why I was always so terrible at environments, because I only did modeling. Everything always felt just great.
Fair enough. Yeah, that would definitely help. One picture that I had is a good example of like composition-wise, because this does feel like a little bit flat. For some reason, it reminded me of the vehicle that Gleb Alexandrov did a while ago. That's like in the snow, and it's just at this like angle. And so this is a good example of like lighting and composition for just like one vehicle sitting in an environment. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend copying it exactly for this scene because it's totally different, but at the same time, you can kind of see how setting it at the angle and then lighting it kind of from the side or like from the other direction could help give it a more like interesting look. And I think the other two Wasps, even though it's cool that they're like flying off into the distance, it creates this interesting like almost like cartoony effect where it looks like the same like bot over time. I don't know, it does distract from it a little bit. I'm not sure how I feel about the two flying off to the right.
Well, you know, to elaborate on that, part of it, like there's clearly like a fleet of vehicles taking off, but there's no context given for like, is this a landing pad? Is this an airport? You know, with it just the one vehicle sitting in, you know, basically a barren desert plain, and then having two taken off in the distance, it does, like you said, it almost feels like, you know, the stages of the vehicle taking off, but that it's the same vehicle, not three of them.
Yeah, that's a good point. I guess on the note about a landing pad is if you put a like CG landing pad, you wouldn't have to worry, like
it'd solve the shadows.
It would solve the shadows, it would solve the grass. That'd probably help quite a bit.
Yeah, I like it.
There we go. All right. Next up is Aaron Rotherham, hover car chase. And this one also super fun. All of these are really like unique and interesting. None of them have been boring so far. Got the main scene and composition done. Been working on the textures, as you can see, but a lot of it still isn't finished, along with the stuff like particle effects and motion blur. Going for a slightly stylized look, and I'm hoping I'm going in the right direction. Mostly looking for critiques on my materials, shaders, and textures, and the general composition, but anything you think would be improved, what's going on would be very much appreciated. Been doing Blender for about a year and a half now, and I feel like this could be gearing up to be my best scene yet. At least I hope so, but I'll let you all be the judge of that. Yeah, I'd say, I mean, if you've been doing Blender for a year and a half, this is really, really good. I'm blown away.
I didn't do anything like this at a year and a half in a Blender. You know, the thing that I like with this in particular, you know, beyond being a cool design, is this one, I think more than just about any of them so far, showcases the value of textures. You know, because as you start to look closer and closer to the model, you'll start to find that there's not a lot of complexity in it. Like there's some super detailed areas, but particularly from afar, the textures sell it. The textures and the silhouette make all the difference in the world for something like this, and it shows. You know, from the scratches on the yellow paint to it clearly being like an original car design. It looks like a little taxi that then has been completely retrofitted, and then having the textures, you know, emphasize that it just sells the whole piece a lot more. And when you then look at the composition scene where, you know, it's being chased by another vehicle, and obviously clearly the environment's not done, it's just blocked out, but you almost don't care.
Mm-hmm.
because all of the focus is on the main vehicle, which has this really nice texturing and shading job. And the more you look at it, you find like some of the modeling details feel a little funky. They maybe not as tangible. There's definitely some areas like this front section where the wheel connects to the I'll call it the cord connecting to the vehicle itself. Doesn't feel nearly as roughed up and feels a little out of place. But again, that's not the focal point, and so you almost don't care. And if this were completely untextured, it wouldn't sell it. So it's just as from somebody that never was any good at texturing, that only modeled and tried to get away with only modeling for the longest time, texturing wins.
Yeah, that's a really good point.
It's much easier to make a crappy model look great with textures than it is to make a really good model look bad with textures.
Though, I don't know, bad textures can definitely take an average model down quite a few notches as well.
That's actually what I intended to say. I think I worded that wrong.
Oh, well, we gotcha.
Yeah, what you said.
Yeah, this looks really good. Yeah, I think in terms of like modeling, the only real notes that I had is that the front of it feels very like mushy or like very soft. It doesn't quite feel like a car. It feels like it's kind of molded out of clay, which could be a cool style in and of itself. But everything else, especially around the wheels and stuff, is very like sharp and detailed. It doesn't need to be necessarily that detailed, but maybe like crisping up some of these edges and like making it look very much more clean. And if they are dented, then have that be an obvious, also sharp dent. I think would help.
And some of that can even come across, in the shaders too, where like these couple of like dings and holes and such in the front, they're too soft. If you think of the way that car paint works over metal, like you don't so much as get a like when they're really extreme like this, particularly on a weathered car, you don't tend to so much as get just a dent. You get like a chip, because a lot of the I don't know if it's on enamel paint, but like the car paint is very thick, even on older cars. And so if you get a big dent like that, you're going to tend to actually have a piece of paint chip off, and you're not going to have this smooth kind of impression like you would in clay, which I think is part of what makes this look mushy. Mm-hmm. Instead, you're going to have a dent and then like paint peeling away and flaking out, which then reveal, in this case, it'd probably be starting to be like rusted metal and whatnot. And so having particularly a major glossy difference between the rusted areas and the dents and scratches, and then the rest of the paint would help a lot, I think. Like if you look at the big scratch along the wheel well here, the scratch itself almost seems to have the same glossiness as the rest of the car paint. But in reality, that wouldn't be the case. It'd actually be the other way around, because all of the glossy material that is the car paint has been scraped away. And so it's going to be less glossy. Now, you might still get a highlight there where it catches the edge, but...
Yeah, that is excellent point.
One thing that I really like in this too is I love the headlights. And I imagine that it's probably just a headlight texture from an old school light like that, but it works really well. I almost wish though that, like, given the composition and given that it's being chased by a police vehicle, like I'd love to see those turned on.
Ooh,
This would be really cool as a sort of a night, either like a night or dusk scene, so that you can take advantage of some of this nice texturing work and really highlight it. Particularly since like all of the focal point, for me at least, is very much on this like front corner of the vehicle, and you could have some fun with it. And if you knocked out the right headlight, if from the perspective of the driver, such that it was broken, number one, it would fit with the very rundown nature of the car. But then only the left one was working, it would also help draw the attention too.
Yeah, I think that'd look really cool. Yeah, that part, like, I didn't really focus on that part before, but now that you mention it, that detail on the front is spot on.
Yeah, and for whatever reason, like that's what my eye is drawn to, which kind of caught me off guard because it's all in shadow. Mm-hmm. And it could just be now I'm staring at it too long and I'm like, oh, that's the part that I like, and so now I'm just intentionally looking at that.
Yeah, and he does have an updated version here as well. That does look a little bit different in terms of like lighting and stuff, and it is more dusky, so that would be perfect.
It's also quite a bit more dynamic. It feels like it's got a greater sense of movement. It looks like you've changed the focal length of your camera, and it really helps to kind of stretch out the scene and provide some distance, which is actually a good example of how, I think it's very easy as a Blender artist or a CG artist in general, and I know I was very guilty of this, of just kind of using the default camera and just never messing with it. But if you start treating it like a photographer, like taking a photography class is probably, if you're doing scenes and environments, learning more about photography is probably one of the best things you can do.
Absolutely. I'll second that.
As, given that you are a photographer after all.
Me?
Yeah. Or
somewhat.
You're more so one than I.
Yeah, as a hobby. I carry a camera around on hikes.
One thing that does really stick out to me in this, in the negative sense, is all the windows feel too dark. Like, I would assume that the intention is that they're basically blacked out windows and whatnot, but they're also lacking environment reflections. Like, they just feel like they're matte black, as if it's just missing. And some of that could be that there's not an environment yet to reflect. But even getting a little bit more reflection in there from the glass, or adding in a broken window would be pretty fitting with the design. Something to help bring that together, because right now, like, they almost feel like just matte black with just a little hint of a reflection, and it creates this weird negative void that just feels like something's missing.
Yeah, I think that would help a lot. One thing I do really like is the design of the police chaser thing. Like, it's definitely very different than the car that's up close, but I immediately knew what it was. Like, it's very clear. Maybe some, like, blue and red flashing lights would be cool as well. But it looks like it should.
I like the discussion in chat about the windows being dark as a cop-out for not doing the interior. I completely understand.
Yeah.
Last vehicle that I ever modeled was the Ferrari from the original Mastering Modeling Workshop.
Yeah.
And I always enjoyed modeling the exteriors of cars. I hated modeling the interiors.
That's so much work.
Oh my gosh, there's so much work. And finding references for those is actually much harder unless you, like, I don't know, if you have a car that you can go, like, sit in and look around and whatnot, it's a lot easier. But I was always really particular trying to get, like, dimensions accurate, and it was a nightmare, and I didn't do it.
So you're saying that founding CG Cookie did not help you buy a Ferrari?
No, it did not.
Oh, bummer. We'll work on that.
I'm going to have to go back to square one.
But yeah, I'm super excited with how this scene's going to turn out. I mean, you said you're going to add motion blur and particles and stuff, and I assume like a little effect for the flying wheels. I think that'll be super fun.
Yeah, I think this scene shows a lot of promise, so definitely I hope you carry on.
Well done. All right, and let's see. Oh, can't click that. That's the other thing. Last one, CG Cookie Dough Hot Rod Wheelchair.
All right.
Also fun.
Yeah.
This is awesome.
Dangerous.
My original idea was to have it be a series of tests the dummy was going to do on the hot rod wheelchair. At some point in the process, I ended up making it at a park. The main thing I'm not sure what to do is how to make it look like a dummy, or if I want it to be a dummy. Haven't had a lot of time recently. I'm surprised I got as far as I did. Please forgive the noise. I didn't have the time to get denoised. No worries on the noise. It's a work in progress.
Suggestion on the dummy. So one thing that you could do on a dummy is, like, look at a bunch of crash test dummies. Crash test dummies always have, like, typically very angular head. They've got some, like, more like hinged joints, but then they also tend to have, like, surface paint on them. Like, if you think back to some of the original, like, Mythbusters episodes, a lot of them might have, a target painted on the front, or they've got, some kind of texture that makes it very clear that it is a dummy, and that would help a lot. And basically, even going back to the vehicle, the hover helicopter Lampel, you had a couple of comments about how like if you change the color of the components, adding in stripes or changing, adding in the red and white for a medical helicopter, that kind of thing. If in this case, if the leg, like the forearms and the lower legs, if they're red and the rest of the body is white and then the head is red or something like that, that alone will make it very clear that, hey, this is intended to be a dummy, not a human stand-in that hasn't yet been finished.
Yeah, exactly. I think, yeah. And even if you model it, if you wanted to simplify it a bit and make it more like a drawing kind of dummy, like those figures that you can like pose for like sketches, and just make it out of primitives, I think that would still work. Like it would still look believable.
Actually, I thought I had one of those somewhere, but I guess I don't. Oh. I was gonna pull it up but yeah, like in particular, like in the case of like a drawing dummy, making sure that each of the limbs is very clearly articulated just through like a hinge or a ball and socket or something like that, as opposed to like right now the dummy feels like it's almost like a like it's all sewn together as one piece, but then has like an internal skeleton. And so actually, I didn't realize that it was a dummy at first. I thought it was intended to be a human character that wasn't yet finished, in part because you've got, organic joints that are bending at the knee, just like they should. And so it starts to feel more humanoid as opposed to, I would think of a dummy being more robotic.
Yeah, or if you wanted to keep it somewhat like this, you could add some like strings and ropes and make it more of like a scarecrow, kind of like just like regular clothes, but like stuffed with hay. Might fit the scene. Also, I was looking at crash test dummies. Yeah, I was looking at crash test dummies for examples, and mostly just found memes. But I thought this was kind of funny.
Yeah, there you go. But that's actually if you see the the thing on the side of its head. That's the exact pattern that I was thinking of that you often see.
That would
like an impact point.
Yeah, it would immediately let you know.
Yeah,
that is a dummy.
Definitely. And also the color difference between the yellow and the black would help a lot too.
Definitely. Yeah, I think a few like notes on things that I think would help quite a bit. One is scale the grass down a lot. Put the like wheelchair kind of next to it, and then scale it down to make it come up to maybe like 3/4 of the way up the like small wheels. Would probably be about right. And you could also, well, the whole picture is about like the motion of this guy. Obviously, like there's flames on the ground and a giant
he's moving
jet of flame. Yeah, he's going real fast. So motion blur number one would be cool as well. That would definitely help. And also
almost essential in this case.
Yeah, I think so. And also arcing that like jet of plasma, like he's going real fast. But like arcing that from the base down towards the ramp to like follow the trajectory, because it seems like he took off even before the ramp even started. In a way, if you like follow the line.
Yeah, I would agree. Another thing that I would add is, and this goes back to the motion blur and kind of the depth of field in this. But if you think of how, unless you're using, I mean, for the vast majority of cameras in this case, the entire environment would be mostly out of focus if you're trying to capture this guy that's going really, really quick, because your camera is going to be swinging to the side while it's focusing on him, and so basically the entire background is going to be blurred in reality. And so that alone, not only does that help, with making the grass a little less the focal point and to blend this line between the road and the grass, it also helps bring the focus to the dummy going across the wheelchair and gives that impression of speed. Like if you think of like times when you watch like car commercials and they're driving along and the camera's like following the vehicle along the side, the whole background, the whole road, everything is just blurring off to the side because the focal point is on the effectively the stationary car and the world's moving around it, as far as the camera's concerned.
That's a great idea.
That would help a lot.
That's a super good idea. I mean, I just kind of thought automatically like, oh yeah, like blur the guy, but like that obviously doesn't make sense for like.
Well, you could focus on the world, but he's more interesting.
Yeah, definitely. And I think a good way to do that and also kind of get the like arc of the jet going in the right way is actually animate him kind of going up and over and track the camera to him, or like set it as a child of the wheelchair. So that way number one, you'll get that arc and you'll get the proper motion blur of the background, and also you'll be able to see which path the like jet should take. It doesn't even have to be like a good animation because it's still going to be just one single frame, but just having that as a reference of which way things are going will help kind of like inform the rest of it.
That it lets you let Blender work for yourself, where basically you animate it, and then the majority of the motion blur and things like that will mostly be taken care of for you. I mean, I say this with a big caveat because motion blur is always hard in animation and rendering. Like something just doesn't work like you intend it to, but all of those things happen because of the physics of how the camera works and what's in focus and what's not. And if you actually just do that, like you make him moving by animating him, and you have the camera following, a lot of the rest will be done for you by Cycles.
Yeah, absolutely. And with all of the things that I'm seeing in the scene, I don't think Cycles would have any problems with this.
I wouldn't think so.
Yeah, it'll do it just right. And I think, yeah, that would help a ton. But
It'd be cool.
Great job, CG Cookie Dough. This is really fun.
Yeah, this is fun.
You've posted in a lot of different entries, and like you started out like super beginner, and then now you're making whole scenes, and I think that's awesome. Like that's super cool. So there we go. Thanks everybody for joining in. Omar had a question. Can we do a special entry really fast of his demo reel? And since it is 12, we had an hour. Not this time. We can take a look at that another time. But it's like it's a full reel.
Okay. Yeah.
Yeah. So it's not like a quick image. However, we will definitely take a look at that because we love how it's going. We checked it out before. I mean, Jay, have you seen his reel so far?
I saw a version, I want to say like 2 months ago, so I haven't seen it recently.
Okay, it's definitely getting really good.
Nice.
So props for that. Keep up the good work, and we'll see you guys pretty soon.
Thanks, everyone.
Yeah.
Cheers.
Have a good rest of the day.
Good work.